is Sally Young. Welcome to Episode 4 of Everything New Orleans, the podcast, where I share my passion for everything New Orleans. New Orleans is a city steeped in tradition, and in this episode, you'll gain insight into one of my favorite traditions, New Orleans traditional jazz. When you hear the phrase traditional jazz, you might ask, what does that mean? Perhaps in the world of music, it's a phrase that separates today's modern jazz from Jelly Roll Morton's ragtime or the orchestral jazz of Duke Ellington, swing of Count Basie, or of course Louis Armstrong. If you're from New Orleans, like my three guests and I, you already know that New Orleans traditional jazz is characterized by more than a period of time separating then and now. My guests are three masters of New Orleans traditional jazz: Dr. Michael White, jazz clarinetist; Gregg Stafford, jazz cornetist and trumpeter; and Wendell Brunious, jazz trumpeter. New Orleans traditional jazz. I think that I have a good idea of what the phrase means, but there might be a bit of uncertainty for some in our audience. Dr. White, as the jazz historian in the group, how is traditional jazz viewed in the world of jazz?
When you say traditional jazz in the jazz world, many times people are talking about forms of jazz that are not the latest or most contemporary form, usually from Duke Ellington's swing era to modern jazz, bebop, cool jazz, and all of that has been labeled as traditional jazz as opposed to avant-garde styles and as opposed to the jazz fusion or smooth jazz.
So when we talk about New Orleans traditional jazz, what do we mean?
In New Orleans, when you say traditional jazz, you're talking about the music that started in New Orleans. You're talking about the first form of jazz, the first jazz style that evolved during the late 1890s among the African-American population of the city. Musicians like Buddy Bolden, the legendary cornet player Charles Buddy Bolden and his generation.
Dr. White, or Michael, are there certain characteristics that you might use to identify this music?
Is characterized by a certain thing, certain instrumentation. For example, in traditional New Orleans jazz, you generally have a brass band or a dance ensemble or a small ensemble, which can consist of anything from really maybe a quartet to a typical 7-piece ensemble.
What instruments are typically used in these ensembles?
Usually the instrumentation is trumpet, trombone, clarinet, banjo, piano, bass, and drums in the prototypical ensemble of traditional New Orleans jazz.
Gregg, you were influenced by this music when you were young. How do you define New Orleans traditional jazz?
When I came up listening to traditional New Orleans jazz, I was listening at people who had played it from an extension of other people prior to their times. I find it sometimes hard to define because the music is played so differently by each individual. I try to stick as close to the melody as I possibly can without going too far off. People that I heard, Kid Sheik, Kid Thomas, Teddy Riley, Alvin Alcorn, all those guys, and I pretty much tried to emulate what they were doing. I find that traditional New Orleans jazz, it lends more to a style of playing.
Wendell, what's your insight on defining the tradition of New Orleans jazz?
All three of us are from New Orleans, so we have a pretty set thing we think of as traditional jazz, being like Michael was saying, the jazz that was started in New Orleans. The earliest form of jazz was the extension of society music and marches and ragtime and stuff like that. That's the way we think of traditional jazz in its, I'm going to call it its purest form.
We often hear the phrase trad jazz. Is this a variation of New Orleans traditional jazz?
There are variants of the term when you say traditional jazz. You hear the term trad jazz, and a lot of times people that refer to trad jazz, that can mean a couple of things. Trad jazz is usually a modern jazz musician's term for New Orleans jazz, or what they call New Orleans jazz when they try to play it. They say they're playing trad. But trad also refers to a certain European variant of traditional New Orleans jazz. In particular, that label has been used with the music that comes out of England, the New Orleans jazz movement. And a lot of times they'll refer to that as trad as well.
This episode of Everything New Orleans, the podcast, is being brought to you in part by the Jazz and Heritage Foundation's Community Partnership Grant, reinvesting the proceeds from Jazz Fest directly into the community. And by Red Clay Productions, Inc., producing content for every aspect of life. And from valued listeners like you. To subscribe to Everything New Orleans, the podcast, please visit www.everythingneworleans.buzzsprout.com.
Imitators came along and they gave it different names because they thought they were playing in that style. The real New Orleans jazz, that's traditional jazz. The early New Orleans jazz, that's traditional. It's tradition to our culture and tradition to our whole way of life. We're not imitating it.
I'm Sally Young, and you're listening to Episode 4 of Everything New Orleans, the podcast. My guests are clarinetist Dr. Michael White, trumpeter Gregg Stafford, and trumpeter Wendell Brunious, three legendary members of the New Orleans traditional jazz community. In this episode, we're talking New Orleans traditional jazz.
New Orleans jazz was really a representation of the way of life of people. And one of the things I discovered when I started playing in the brass bands and in the social club parades and church parades and funerals was that this music had nothing to do with the commercial music of Bourbon Street, the fast, loud, comic, almost corny stuff that you hear with people showing off. This was a community music that represented the spirit of New Orleans people. In that spirit, people danced to the music, and in a sense, there was collective creation between people dancing on the street and the musicians. But I started to realize that the music represented a way of life. I could see the way people laugh, the way they dance, the way they walk, the way they talk. All of that is in the music, a New Orleans way of life.
How is the second line a part of this unique New Orleans traditional jazz culture?
Second line dancing is a free form that goes with social club parades and traditional jazz music. There's no one way of doing it. Everybody does their own thing. But if it's not real, you can see it in an instant. It's a representation of what the way of life is that comes to fruition through our music and our celebration.
Gregg, it seems that maintaining the authenticity of the tradition is a major part of your work to keep the legacy pure. How do you know when it's real or when it's just done for money?
The approach and the style. And as Michael said, when you hear it, you'll know it. There are a lot of people that have came to New Orleans and tried to play New Orleans jazz, but they don't understand how it's played because a lot of them have not been through the ranks of playing in brass bands and playing on the streets. And you see the second liners dancing to the music. It comes together because sometimes the way the people dance allows the musicians to play a certain way.
So it's pretty obvious that there's a lesson to be learned about the authenticity of New Orleans traditional jazz, and it's much more than just a way to hustle tourists.
A lot of people who've come to New Orleans have not gotten that because they haven't played the streets. But when I think of New Orleans traditional jazz being played in the spirit of it, it embodies the whole community. Church parades, which is now become extinct. I belong to a lot of social and pleasure clubs. Some of my members have their specific musicians that they enjoy listening to. Many occasions years ago, they used to have second liners who would pick out their own personal musician that they would listen to. So all that tends to give the musician playing a little motivation to even play better while he's playing in the brass band.
Michael, I've heard you make reference to our gumbo making tradition to distinguish authentic New Orleans traditional jazz from inauthentic. How do we know when it's real and when it's not?
You ask what it is, when it is, and when it isn't. Other places, people tend to think of gumbo if they try to make gumbo and they're not from New Orleans or they haven't been schooled by New Orleans people. It just turns out to be some kind of soup. But in New Orleans, we don't think of gumbo as soup. It's a very special dish where you mix a lot of things that don't normally go together. Pork and poultry and seafood going together in one dish, and yet they do, and it comes up with something special. There's no one way to make New Orleans gumbo. Everybody's mama, grandmother, auntie, nana's godchild's mama can make a great gumbo. Some are better than others, but everybody has their own touch. But when it is New Orleans gumbo, you know what it is. If it isn't, you know it isn't.
You know, when Mike's saying about these different styles we have, I've got one voice, Michael's got another voice, Gregg, that we didn't purposely seek to, I'm going to find my voice. It's the reflection of all the things that we've witnessed, you know, hearing George Lewis, hearing, Kid Thomas, and hearing Teddy Riley, hearing different people and paying attention and getting something from that. Rather than, man, listen to that old stuff, bro. This is the kind of attitudes we're getting now, and you're like, you better listen.
Gregg, when Herman Sherman passed on the leadership of the Young Tuxedo Brass Band to you, he also passed on to you a symbol of the legacy in the form of a satchel filled with sheet music that was actually played during the parades.
Herman Sherman passed his satchel down to me when he designated me to become the leader. You remember they used to carry these satchels, the band leaders.
Yeah, carry in the satchel,
and
exactly.
Those dirges from that band, all those songs that you heard that they were recorded. Howard Dejon used to carry a bag, Louis Cottrell.
Percy Humphrey.
Percy Humphrey.
Percy Humphrey with the Eureka.
What a treasure. Gregg, do you see brass bands and second lines following any of the traditions today?
Traditional jazz that we saw on the streets of New Orleans is totally different from what I saw coming up. As I was talking to you the other day, I talked about Brother Thibodeau's funeral and the younger musicians, how they came undressed. So it was a different kind of image. One side of the band was dressed in black and white, and the other side of the band was dressed in street clothes. So I don't think the younger musicians are even trying to make an effort to even try to carry the tradition on in the way it was done years ago. There are a few of them that are capable of trying to learn it. That's one thing the Black Men of Labor has tried to do. They have hired the younger musicians and mandated that they play specifically traditional songs on the street.
I'd like to add that the Black Men of Labor is a social aid and pleasure club whose history is directly linked to the New Orleans traditional jazz culture.
So we have a parade. When we have our parade, we don't want to hear nothing else but traditional New Orleans jazz, brass band music. We want to hear the old hymns. We want to hear the old marches. And we even go a little bit further to pay the young musicians a little bit more just to give them incentive to want to play the parade. So that's one of the things we have been trying to do.
So Gregg, is it making a difference?
I don't see any young musician that even interested in trying to play traditional music. You know, they'll learn 2 or 3 hymns to play a funeral, and that's about it.
Wendell, you've managed to mentor 2 trumpeters that will certainly be a part of your legacy.
I have 2 young trumpet players that came up under me when they were teenagers, and that's my nephew, Mark Burrow, and Kevin Lewis. What has happened, we kind of self-educated and got around people who were educated musically, but a lot of what we know, we learned by ear, and that gives you your personal style, your interpretation. I mean, it's kind of like what Buddy Bolden did. He wasn't a reader, but he'd play the songs that he was hearing. Every time he could play it differently because he couldn't repeat it because it was not on the paper. A lot of the respect for older musicians has been lost. That's the thing we grew up with, coming up around Danny Barker and Louis Barberin and everybody. You know, I mean, when I was 3 years old, the Tuxedo Brass Band, they recorded a record marching around in our backyard and up the driveway, and it's called Jazz Begins. I know you know the record. And there's a picture of my sister and I in there taken by Lee Friedlander. I mean, it's one of my earliest memories. For you to remember something, it pretty much has to be either important to you or had such an impact on you that you can't forget it. But in this case, it's both. That was, I mean, just to see Wilbur Tillman, and when they were doing that thing, Feel So Good, and Wilbur Tillman did, whoop, 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 oh my God, man, what is that? I wished I could have done that, you know? And it's all of these things, and like my daddy and Andy Anderson and Albert Walters, Albert Fernandez, whatever you want to call him, Ernest Caglialetti. That's 4 powerful of that era. That was 4 of the most powerful trumpet players in New Orleans. Wilbur Tillman, I mean, Paul Barberin and Emil Knox and you know, I mean, important people in the history of this music just at our house making a record, a gig, whatever you want to call it. And then pay attention to that and really value that as something really valuable. And to have that kind of an impact on you allows you and opens doors for you to absorb things that were happening that you didn't even know they were happening.
Thanks for listening to Everything New Orleans. I'm Sally Young, and this podcast was created to share the stories that originate from my experience working as a media professional in radio and conducting interviews at music festivals and events locally and around the world. Everything New Orleans, the podcast, is an extension of my joy and my service as a native New Orleanian.